All right, welcome to the podcast. I think we are on episode 71 now. So we're starting to roll through them pretty good. And just as we're really catching week after week steam, we will be taking a break next week. I'll be on vacation. So we'll have a break next week. This will be our last one for, until 2 weeks from now. And today I was chatting with Dave and we wanted to kind of dive in on a topic. Just now, it's funny because recently we've been getting some people coming back to the gym post-pandemic, and a lot of people are asking, how should I get started back? And we did a podcast kind of talking a little bit more about like Power Hour and some things and you coaching. And I've actually got 3 emails recently. Should I start back in our Power Hour classes, or how should I get started back? So I think we wanted to dive into just making your fitness come back. If you've had an extended break, an injury, you haven't been to the gym for a while and you want to get it going again, and just some tips and ways to conceptualize getting back into the gym. So I think right off the bat, and this seems like really easy advice or something anyone, but it's start slow and start light and build momentum over time. And as easy it is as that is to say, it's hard to execute, especially for people who have, if you train, say you did CrossFit for 5 to 10 years and you took 3 years off, you're going to be looking at your old numbers, your old times, all of those things. You're going to get a week or 2 into it and you're going to start trying to attack weights and things that you haven't done in a long time. And it's going to be really frustrating if you do that. So I think the best advice right off the bat is start slow, stay light, try to hit singles. If I'm using a baseball analogy, hit singles. Don't try and hit any home runs. Don't try and grip and rip like prescribed weight and do things like that. Start very slow and build a snowball going downhill over time. That's the biggest mistake that I've not only seen, but I've actually done myself. So I'll get back into training and I'll try and go really aggressively hard, way too fast. And I end up taking an injury, and there's nothing that'll stall your progress faster than taking that injury, because it's really deflating. And then that will probably again lead to another long layoff, more from that mental aspect than even the physical aspect. You might take an injury that is like a, 2 to 3 week injury, but then you're just like, oh, my body can't handle CrossFit anymore. And I'm not going to do it. So,
yeah. I think like, even if you, like you said, if you have a lot of experience training and there's a layoff or a break for life situations or injury, things like that, you almost have to approach it the same way someone who's never trained before.
Yep.
Right. Because your body's kind of, it may be in a little bit better shape, but the untrained person's kind of a blank slate and they're always just kind of learning things. And as a coach and as a trainer, you're like, all right, let's take it slow. Let's build up some capacity and, strengthen your connective tissue, and let's get in shape and let's get those, the movement patterns down right. But as an experienced person who's taken time off, it's really kind of the same approach, but mentally you're in a different spot. There's a little bit of your ego is like, I can do this. I can just jump right back in. Yep. And you know what you're doing for the most part. You know what everything looks like, but it's just kind of really takes some effort to hold yourself back from going that hard, right? So it's maybe setting, a certain amount of hours per week, that you're in the gym, certain amount of days you're a week in the gym initially, and just kind of building that up over time, keeping your workouts like under an hour for sure. I think most people, like if you're hitting a workout for an hour, that's probably more than anyone needs.
Yep.
If you're spending 2 hours doing something, it's probably going to end up being a case where you're overtraining, right?
Yep.
So
I think always erring on the side of it's a little too easy when you start is really good. And if you look at it, say you look at it from like an 8 to 12 week perspective, if you start at like you're deadlifting, say you used to deadlift 405 and you're doing like a strength session, you're going to work up in that first week. Let's say you're just like, I'm going to do my last set of 3 is going to be 225, like half of the weight. Mm-hmm. You start there and it's like, this is this isn't bad. This is like pretty easy. Like there's a lot left in the tank. Well, if every week when you do that, you go up, 5% on your weights and you're like starting at 50%, in 8 to 12 weeks, you're going to be back to where you were, 3 years ago, pretty quick. And your body's going to acclimate to it. And almost like you were talking about when you were scuba diving, it's like you have to go up and then your body settles in. And
if you go too fast, you're going to die.
Yeah, you're going to get the bends,
Yeah,
And I think it's like that in fitness too, where you jump into it and you go too fast, you're gonna crash and burn. I think another way, rather than just jumping right back into your old routine, if you're someone, even like myself, I put myself in this category where I have a certain amount of ego. I'm a little prideful with like CrossFit, and even as I've gotten older, sometimes it can be frustrating to me because I remember certain workout times and things like that. Doing a fitness modality similar to like our Rev or Power Hour program for a time that you have zero ego attached to it can also be a good way to ease back in, because it's not competitive. It's not something you're going to try and go over your head with. It's a little more controlled, and it can be a great bridge back to something like CrossFit. So you're lifting weights, you're getting like your muscles and your tendons strong, and then the transfer back into training CrossFit is going to be not as challenging, not as hard. Your strength's built back up. It'll take some time to get your conditioning back. But if you take, a couple months and do something like that, I think that can work really well. And that's worked well for me in the past, bridging between injuries and getting back in. Like if I've taken some sort of injury that's like, this thing's just kind of, it's usually an overuse injury that's kind of chronically starting to bother me.
Yep.
I'm like, this is going to take a little while. I trained through this for 4 months and like, I'm going to have to actually take some time off, this certain type of movement. So I'll just change modalities a little bit.
Yeah. And if you're kind of lifting for a bit, it may just be like, all right, I'm going to do some conditioning on the side. So just doing, single kind of monostructural workouts, whether it's, running, rowing, swimming, things like that. Or even if you want to, sneak in some metcons or WODs like that, just keep them simple, like rowing and push-ups or things like that. Or something like an EMOM or every 90 seconds. So you have a little bit of there's a conditioning component to it. It's challenging metabolically, but you have some breaks in there. So you're paying attention to your form, and it's not just go, one thing after the other. Yeah.
I think you definitely need to do that when you're bridging back into CrossFit. So like if you were just doing power, or you're just lifting, it would be wise to, every other day you're going to hit a good hard row. You're going to run, maybe do a little bit of burpees, start to mix some of those movements in there. So the second you get your heart rate up, you're not just freaking out and panicking. I know that transition back, your body's going to be a little different too, through age sometimes, life circumstances. So you have to respect it. If you've had a surgery, you also have to respect that injury a little bit more too. And I've seen people come back after 5 years and you're not in the same spot. Maybe that person was 28 and they were single and they lived in an apartment around here. And now they have a house, a wife, and a 3-year-old or something. Your whole life circumstance is different. They were maybe in level 2 and now like that's probably not going to be the best way for them to train now. We're looking for a more sustainable approach for an hour a day, 4 days a week. So you have to look at all those factors too. And again, it's like one of those things where people try to jump into it, I think, too fast. And I was very mindful of this last year. I was getting back into boxing and I really wanted to fight. And I knew the biggest obstacle I was going to have was staying healthy and making it to this fight. And I was like, I have to build into this slow. So I started like just doing conditioning stuff. And then once a week I was hitting mitts. And I did that for probably 6 weeks. I'm like, okay, I can add a day, another month or two. And then I added another day. But I knew I had to ease into it slow, because the second I was slamming and hitting bags and sparring and doing things like that, if I did that too quick, I was going to take like a wrist or a hand injury. It was just going to, and the second I do that, those can take 4 to 6 weeks to heal. And I was just going to quit. Yeah. And I'm like, I have to be very meticulous on how I get back. So if you're coming back to, be mindful of, say, the injury that took you out. Like, yeah, it's fine. But, you know, if you hurt your shoulder, maybe doing pull-ups or something like that, you know, hit ring rows for a month or two.
Yeah.
Maybe you just stay there, do banded strict pull-ups indefinitely until you have ultimate confidence that your shoulders feel phenomenal.
Yeah. Or even, you know, some people, I worked with a guy recently who, you know, had shoulder surgeries a while ago and generally moves pretty well and is strong. But I think just if you hang from the rig or doing a lot of swing or kipping, I think there's only just a certain amount of time, many times a week he can do that.
Yep.
So if we do pull-ups one day, if there's toes to bar a couple days later, I'm like, hey, let's do some V-ups or, you know, set an incline bench along the post and do leg raise that way. You're still going to get the same stimulus, but you have to be mindful of like just the capacity of your body now, like what it can take. Even if your form is good, you know, if you've got some, you know, chinks in your armor, like there just might be a permanent, you know, kind of modification you need to do going forward. So and then there's nothing wrong with it. It's just like understanding that too.
That's a phenomenal, like, I like that, that note, because that was a change I made personally when I transitioned from like competitive CrossFit, and I probably took close to a year off. I was doing power hour and like some jujitsu. And when I came back, the biggest shift that I made was I do things like handstand push-ups, ring muscle ups, and Olympic weightlifting like 4 days a week. It was just a lot of very explosive movements, and my joints were just kind of a wreck for a little while. And it was 5 years of that, 5 years of that, 4 or 5 days a week, just a lot of like very dynamic, explosive, just juggling 200 pounds of weight, crashing down on your body, like flinging myself up on the rings. My shoulders, hips, and knees just were really pissed off. And I kind of was always chasing something. When I came back, the adjustment I made, I remember, if I did muscle ups in a week, I would take a whole week off. Like I wouldn't do them more often than every other week. If I did handstand push-ups, I would take a full week off. So I would never do them more than twice a month, ring muscle ups or handstand push-ups. And then with pull-ups, anytime I did kipping pull-ups, the next workout, I would make sure it was strict. Yeah. So I tried to alternate it and put time between it, and it worked wonders on keeping my shoulders healthy because I was able to put more time, make sure things were healed up, because you're juggling and balancing a lot of different stimuluses and all of that type of stuff. So I started to be way more methodical on that, and it worked. I found a really good flow for like 5 years where I was just like, okay, nothing's bothering me too much, and that was a big thing.
I think something that's kind of helped over the time and just becoming a better programmer and running a gym and kind of giving people workouts and coming up with them. I think we all understand the idea that I can't squat, over 90%, so many times a week or so many times in a session, right? There's a certain amount of like volume I can lift heavy weights, whether it's a squat or deadlift. That's kind of something we all get initially at first, but, you also have to consider too, when you're talking about muscle ups and kipping, like from a joint standpoint, like how many days a week am I bending my knee in a loaded position, right? Like it doesn't even matter the weight, right? So if I'm not going to squat so many times a week, like, I can work on mobility or do some like gentle squatting work just to, to make sure my joints are always fluid and moving. But there is a certain idea of like, how many times am I going overhead in a week? How many times am I going in this direction, that direction, and just using these different movement patterns. And just from a joint perspective, like, all right, why is my elbow bugging me, my shoulder? Because I've been pressing weight and bending my elbow 3 days in a row in a loaded position with a lot of reps. So, some days like you have to program or do workouts where my arms are going to stay straight, right? If I want to get a little upper body stimulus, maybe it's a farmer's carry, or just handstand holds, right? Or isometric, where things where that joint isn't always moving under a load.
Yeah.
And that's kind of again, these are so many different variables to kind of take in, but that's also an aspect of, in the same way you're looking at percentages and, lifting weights, it's also kind of just from a movement, point of view, like how many times a week or a month am I kind of moving in these directions or moving these joints in certain ways. And like I said, even if you're moving them correctly, there's a point where things get overused
100%.
And you don't really recognize it in a really micro scale, but you're like, after, 3 or 4 months or a certain amount of time, you're like, man, I'm just like really worn down or things are hurting. Yeah. And like, oh, why do I have tendonitis there?
There's, I think people are kind of reductionist in their thinking of like, if you move well, you'll never get hurt. And that's not true. You have to, volume and reps will catch up with you over time. Great examples are guys at the top end of our sport, like Chris Spieler and Rich Froning, where you watch them squat. I don't know if I've seen guys squat much better than they do. It's like
they move
picture
really well.
Perfect. Both of them have had knee issues, like I know Rich has got stem cells shot in his knee, and I don't know. I know that Chris, just by following his Instagram, like he'll have, modified ways he squats, or he won't squat for a long period of time because he's had some like tendonitis issues.
I don't even think he really snatches anymore either because of the shoulder.
Yeah. So and these guys move impeccably well. Like they move like the video, like you're supposed to do it under duress. Both of them had a lot of longevity in the sport. They took a lot of risks and lots of reps, but at the same time, it's not a free lunch. If you move well, will you get away with more? 100%. You can put a lot more volume on it, but you have to be mindful of how many reps you're doing, how often you're doing it, and give yourself the proper amount of time to rest. And it's a little different for everybody. So the programs that we're putting together here, we're being really mindful of. I'm always looking at like, did we do shoulders, like the knee bending, all of that stuff. But that being said, what I'm putting out 7 days a week might not work perfectly for every single person. So if you see that workout where it's like, oh man, we're doing wall ball, on Thursday after we did a really heavy squat session Monday, and my knees just don't quite feel ready, that might be a good day to go over to barbell, hit some rowing, still move, but not necessarily do that workout because that might not be the best workout for you that day. So you have to be mindful of that stuff. And again, especially building back when you're making a comeback, you have to be really mindful of, I think, the volume on individual joints. And if you start to feel something brewing, again, that injury is going to be your most likely thing to derail it. So even if you're going 2 days a week for a month, you're still building a little bit of momentum. I don't ever recommend anyone do anything 2 days a week. I think everyone should be in the gym at least about 4 days a week training. But it might be 2 classes, and it might be a row and a bike day for a little while. Mm-hmm. You're moving 4 days a week, and then the next month it's 3 classes and then a row and a bike day, something like that. So you're still building momentum, and you're getting time, and you're building confidence in that comeback. Yeah.
I think just sometimes it's hard to like, the untrained person, like I said, is just kind of hopefully open to just whatever advice, hopefully great advice, that someone's giving them to ramp things up in a safe, progressive manner. But it is tougher for that person who's getting back into things where, you really have to mentally hold yourself back.
Yeah, you've built that foundation, and you want to and you have muscle memory.
Yeah.
So you know how to move. The thing that it's a great governor on new people is their lack of capacity in all of these areas. It forces a progression that is not super fast. Now they might want to get there fast, but their body kind of shuts down when they have a certain amount of weight in their hand, or they, you can only do 2 strict pull-ups, you don't really have the pop to hurt yourself yet. But if you've taken 3 years off and you have the contractile potential to, still rip off a set of 20 kipping pull-ups, you can hurt yourself. And a great example is it was 1 year, I think it was like 2018. It happened to 2 guys at the gym. And since then we've put out content. We actually did a video or a podcast talking about how to prep for Murph, because about 4 or 5 years ago, we had never had an issue with anyone like getting injured or anything with Murph. We had 2 guys who were very capable athletes, really strong. Neither of them had trained, one maybe for 6 weeks, one for 3 months. And we're running these big Murph heats. Mm-hmm. And they just kind of like, I can't miss Murph this year. Came in and did Murph with weight vests on. And we're doing like butterfly pull-ups. And, both of them got cases of rhabdo. And while neither of them, it wasn't like serious or life-threatening, they did, I think one of them did have to like spend a day or 2 in the hospital.
That is the perfect recipe for rhabdo. It's not, it is a risk in any sport you do or any kind of training you do, but it is the capable, strong athlete with a little bit of break that comes back and still thinks that they have what they had before.
Yep.
Right? And there's, the example I always think of was they had great intentions, but there was, I forgot which college team it was. I don't know if it was Iowa. I literally forget. This is maybe 10 years ago where, they had a bunch of these D1 football college athletes, just big, strong guys. And I think they had some time off during a summer break and they came back for, preseason conditioning and they just did all this sled work for like
I think I heard this story.
Yeah.
Online.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a great learning example. And I don't think anyone was seriously injured, but that is the case where, you've got people that are really muscular and really capable and that they're in this group and they do want to let each other down.
A bunch of people got rhabdo, didn't they?
I forgot what percentage of the team was, but it was an obscene amount of people. It
ruined their team. I think they did a bunch of back squats too at a light load, like 100 reps or
lots
something.
Lots of reps, lots of volume in the legs going hard. And you're in an environment that is just like, let's go, right? And that is like, no wonder that happened.
Yeah.
A great learning lesson. I don't know if the coach was let go, but not the head coach, but I know they came under. Yeah, I know they came under some heat about that. But that is a case that I always remember. Like it's in the case of the athlete that's taking a break that mentally still thinks they have it, but physically needs to build up that capacity. That is usually what happens.
Yeah.
The newer person, someone who's not as strong, they're usually not going to put themselves in a position where they can get that. That level of intensity just isn't there. And it just depends on the movement too. In certain areas, like, your biceps and hamstrings tend to be areas that really get rhabdo easily, just, especially doing, whether banded pull-ups or ring rows, just that it gets overloaded.
You're moving a lot of range of motion in a tiny little muscle group.
Yeah. Just gets overloaded.
Yeah. That incident, I remember hearing about. That was like a famous, blunder for a strength and conditioning coach. And I would feel bad for that guy, because he was probably just trying to build camaraderie with the team.
Yeah, and that situation or that kind of situation has probably happened many times before, and there was no issues. But again, maybe just take it a little too far. It's just the right combination of maybe it was just they were dehydrated. There was a long enough break. We were pushing too hard against squats with sleds. This was just the perfect recipe for not just 1 or 2, but a considerable amount. It was probably 20 or something. I forgot the exact numbers. You guys can look it up. But
I remember that very well. I remember reading about that.
Yeah.
It just totally ruined these guys. I think it took some guys out maybe for quite a while too. Yeah.
Yeah, not just specifically, a conversation about rhabdo, but just that's a perfect example of getting back into training after a break and just going too hard, too fast.
The mental aspect, I think, is the biggest one to overcome, and it's really humbling yourself to come back to an environment maybe where you felt really comfortable and confident, and you're coming back with maybe a few pounds to lose, a body part that was injured that left you kind of mentally scarred from, you're not confident in that body part, and it's coming back into that environment and knowing even if things are going to change a little bit, that you can build the confidence to feel comfortable again. Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is, and I keep going back to it, it's start slow. It's be very humble, and don't try to compete when you're just working back. And I think this is as much for myself when I talk about things like this as it is for other people, because I'm the biggest,
we could be hypocrites too.
Yeah. I'm the biggest hypocrite.
We haven't solved this problem, but like, we're just talking it out. Like,
I'm talking through it in my head because I know that like, this is something that I always need to do. And when I'm able to actually execute on this, it's usually with something I have less of an ego with. Say like I'm doing power hour now, like I'll hit something that's kind of heavy and I'm like, okay, that's good. I'm not pushing the last 10 to 15 pounds out of it, like failing. And, I'm like, okay, that's okay. And I have less of an ego with that than I do with, a CrossFit workout that I've done half a dozen times and I have all these scores, and I'm worried, people are going to come up and be like, oh, did you PR on that? And like, absolutely not,
And just know what movements are, higher risk versus lower risk. Like a heavy bench kind of, as long as you're, healthy upper body, healthy shoulders, like maybe, pushing at 1 rep and struggling isn't bad, but that's different than a deadlift or a back squat.
Yes.
There's just the consequences of that are a little more dire.
Where you have to move so aggressively and so fast, like you don't almost know what's going to happen, especially if your body is not conditioned to moving those heavier weights. It hasn't done that in a while, but you have done it at one point. I remember the coach who Jack coached under, Shane, who runs CrossFit Conjugate. He was one of those guys who lifted at Westside Barbell, did powerlifting meets, set records in certain weight classes, and was just a guy who lifted tons of weight, those kind of weights that don't make sense almost to like CrossFit people in powerlifting, benching 500-600 pounds, all that kind of stuff. Well, he doesn't train that way now. And, he does a lot of accessory work. He does some like kickboxing and things like that. So I was down there taking the Conjugate seminar, and we were talking about just what we're talking about as far as like people who have previously built a lot of capacity. He was talking about, I think his name was Magnus. Do you remember the big strongman guy?
Magnuson?
Yes.
Magnuson?
Yes.
Yeah, that name sounds familiar.
Yes, that guy. Yeah. From, he would win the strongman contests all the time in the 90s on ESPN.
ESPN, like 1 in the morning.
Yes, exactly. So he was a phys ed teacher over in Europe. So he's telling the story how like all these kids challenged him to like a race, and he's like got pissed off, or so he's gonna race. I can't tell. I don't remember the story well. I'm really probably just butchering the hell out of it. But so he lines up to race, and he's like, I'm gonna explode. And this guy, again, he was like the strongest guy in the world at one point.
Yeah.
And has a lot of contractile potential. He goes and runs, and I think his both quad, like each step within the first like 4 steps, his quads tore straight off the bone.
Yeah.
So this is like that high end, example of like getting into something way too fast where, hey, if he had like built into sprinting over a 12-week period, he probably could have successfully ran that 100-meter race.
Yeah.
But he exploded, and it like, both of his quad tendons like ruptured immediately. And then Shane told a story how personally he, all these guys, they're huge powerlifters, some of like the strongest guys in the country. They're at his gym, like he needed to move a monolift or something. They were like fiddling around with it, and he got really pissed off. Like, how can you guys not move this thing? And he got really mad, and he like picks the thing up and like slides it or moves it, but he did something very similar, like tore, like ruptured a quad tendon or did something, like had a catastrophic injury. And he's like, I have a ton of contractile potential still, but my joints were not ready for moving 700 pounds like across the room like I did.
Yeah, it's funny. Even if you're a well-conditioned athlete, there's certain movements that when you move so fast, I sent you that kind of sprinting program the other day because I just, it's such a fundamental human movement, but we sometimes get in this routine of jogging, especially, in sports, it's all sprinting, right? And so as you get a little older, sometimes it's nice to like really retain that ability to move fast, and not just kind of jog around. And if you still do want to do some running, it's actually probably a safer way to run, like intervals of 400s, 800s, short distances with rest, because you build up, a good level of conditioning if you're doing repeated intervals and you're moving fast, so you're still developing power and speed and some strength in your legs, and your form stays better because you're just not out there, shuffling along for an hour.
You start to break your position.
Yeah, you break your position. So you can, if you can hold on to a good form for 10 or 30 seconds, it's a great way to still run and get all the benefits of running, but also just that power and speed development. But it's funny though, in CrossFit, we do a lot of 400s, 200s, things within workouts, but just like all out sprinting, it is a tough thing. I think it should be part of people's programming, but it is very hard to do on a large scale because it does have that capacity to really kind of snap something. Right?
You have to be very careful.
Very careful. Yeah. For me, it's always like I have to, because I can still move pretty fast. I've sprinted my whole life. And if I do too many, 100s, 200s in a session, like my hamstrings will really start twinging on me, right? Just because they're snapping so fast and turning over really quick that I really have to watch the volume on that. And it was sprinting too. It's almost like you just want the right dosage. You don't need to do a ton of it because it can get really fatigued fast, especially if you have some, capability to move quickly and you have some muscle. Like there is that potential of just kind of pulling something, and you don't want to do that. So it was kind of getting back into sprinting a little bit. And even when I was doing some the other day, I was probably holding back at like 90%. I was afraid to kind of go all out because
cut it loose.
Yeah. And I just, even before I started, I was doing a lot of your basic, butt kicks, high knees, kind of basic track warm up and doing some, 30 meter like progressive runs where you just kind of jog and then you build up speed. It's kind of that kind of 40-yard dash, 100-meter dash where it's like, 0 to 60 as fast as you can, especially at our age, or if you haven't really built up that capacity. I like kind of building up into it. So maybe it's like I was doing that one day. It was basically 15 seconds, pretty fast, 10 seconds, moderately fast. And the last 5 seconds was an all-out sprint. So it's kind of this build-up progression thing where you're kind of building to the top end speed over the course of 30 or 45 seconds, which feels much safer because by the time you get to that last, 5-second sprint, you're a little fatigued already. So it's not going to be 100%. You've kind of warmed up to it. You know what I mean? As opposed to just like down on the blocks and going and your hamstrings or your quad snap. You know?
You have to really build in the past 30 on sprinting. Don't ever recommend anyone just like sending it right off the bat.
And that's kind of a good story because I know someone who's done that for gyms before. And like, it's an awesome thing. It was generally safe for everyone. But again, you go outside in the parking lot, hey, we're going to do some 100s, 200s today. And like, that's it, or that's the workout, or this is the strength or skill session for today. And you've warmed them up properly, but it's just like, go. And like probably 2 or 3 people pulled hamstrings that day.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You have to be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a thing that's great, but you really just have to, it is truly, as strong as you think you are, Metcon wise or weightlifting wise, it is a certain type of modality that does require a lot of buildup and prep work a little bit. Certainly a nice thorough warm up, and maybe if you haven't sprinted in a while, right, maybe keep that at about 85 or 90%, and just that may be all you need just going forward at all. Again, if someone's chasing you, you're running after whatever. Like full send it. Adrenaline's going, but hopefully no one's in that situation. But just as far as a training tool, you could probably get all the benefits of sprinting by just not trying to win the Olympics, but let's go 90.
You need to really respect it and Here we did a little bit more of that at the old gym. We had a little better space in the parking lot to run. We would run like 50s and 100s. We had a little wider space, a little less. So we would do that in classes. Usually we did it at a tempo that didn't quite allow like full out sending it. And we actually did sprints at the Tulum retreat. But what we did is we ran them from just outside of the water to out to waist deep. So I did it intentionally to slow people down because you can't run that fast once the water's slowing you down. Mm-hmm. So we would run as hard as we can. Once you got waist deep, you dove in and then you sprinted back. Yeah. But I did that intentionally because I'm like, I don't want half the people like limping out of here with hamstring injuries. Yeah. Back in 2010, I hadn't sprinted all out in probably 5 years. And I'd gotten to CrossFit and doing all this. And I was doing .com back when we were at the old Rogue Gym. And I went to Gahanna's track, drove over there, and it was 1000s. And I was really fit, super fit, and I was fast. And I was like 28 or 9, competitive in CrossFit. I felt really good. And I went for it. And I was running them all like, around like 14 seconds. I was really going. Maybe had some like, I think I sent 1 or 2 and got them under 13. I was just booking like all out, super hard 100s. I've never been that sore in my life. Oh, yeah. And luckily I didn't get hurt. I was at least young and supple enough where I didn't rip my hamstrings, but both hamstrings were sore.
Were so sore. I guarantee.
Almost 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's happened to me before.
I've never been that sore in my life.
It's kind of a good feeling, like that, a nice hamstring pump. But yeah, that fast turnover speed of sprinting really torches the hamstrings a lot. For
2 weeks I was sore. I remember still feeling, and it was all muscular soreness, but like 2 weeks I was like, I can't believe that did that to me. Mm-hmm. So I remember like, I need to do this more often. Yeah. And I did. I was like, I need to make sure I'm sprinting because I should never be that sore from like an activity I used to just do without thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I used to be able to just do it on command without thinking. And I'm like, if I run that hard, that fast. Yeah. I got to be careful. And I think whether it's sprinting, pulling deadlifts, doing, muscle ups, all of these things as we age, as we're making fitness comebacks, need more and more respect and more build up into it. And we can regain those capacities, especially when we've built all of those connections. And like if you're coming back to CrossFit, what is really cool is you're not starting from being a beginner. You've built neurological connections. You've built a base of like, muscular memory and things that you're going to progress faster than a normal beginner. And it's going to be really fun, but you have to respect that journey and do not compare yourself to that old version of you. And everyone romanticizes like this version of like this perfect version of themselves. Like, oh, I need to get back to doing this. Like, yeah, that existed for like 3 months. Yeah. You're usually dealing with some little thing here or there, but respect it, build into it, find a good spot where you're like feeling good, and then start to like introduce those tough, challenging skills. I think that's my best advice. Like if anyone's listening to this, who's, used to come in and they're like thinking about coming in, like listen to this and apply it to your comeback. And if you have any questions, again, you can ask me and Dave when we're coaching classes, but Yeah,
I would say too, in whether you're coming up with a plan yourself or working with your coach or trainer, come up with a blueprint for the next 8 weeks or whatever amount of time it is, like a plan of how many days per week you're going to work out here or there, and really stick to it. Like put it in writing and create a plan, because your mind and your body, you will kind of be like, well, I think I'm doing all right. I'm kind of adapting this pretty well. I think I'm ahead of schedule. And that's where, like I said, your mind can get you in trouble a little bit because, your ego thinks it's better than your body. So, create that plan, that blueprint to, get to where you want to be. There's really no rush. If it takes longer than you thought, it doesn't matter. Just create that plan, try to stick to it so you don't overload yourself too fast, no matter how good you're feeling at the time. But I think, having a good plan to start off with allows for that, not getting in that situation where you overtrain too early,
Yeah.
and not just go by, do I feel okay? Create a very kind of subtle, gentle progression back into things. And once it's been a few months and you're good to go, and now we can kind of create a sustainable plan from there. But just getting back into it, give yourself a plan to stick to it. Try not to deviate from it, no matter how good you're feeling.
I love that. And I'm going to apply that to myself too, because I need to put rules on myself.
Put rules in place.
I really like that, because I'll just like, hey, I'm going to do this for a certain amount of time. But when I don't have anything like really written down,
it's easy.
It'll just kind of go out the window.
Yeah, it's easy to go off script if you don't put rules and constraints on yourself, especially as someone who's, was at a certain place before and you're getting back into it. I'll give this advice, but I probably won't take it sometimes. I'm just joking.
I think that's
the more I see that in myself and others, it becomes more of a priority in what I'm trying to do, and not trying to let my ego, think it's better than me. For sure.
I think that's a great place to leave it. And we'll see you guys back in 2 weeks. Have a good 4th of July.